Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, Hogan wields veto pen, shoots down immigration reform bills. Hans Riemer challenges Mark Elrich in county executive race. And the honor system. How soon will Montgomery County residents give up their beloved masks? Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher. Former county council member and founder of SkillSmart, a technology startup working to build stronger communities, Mike Knapp. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. It's always wonderful to see the dynamic tension between the legislature and the executive branch. And this week it was put on display. On May 26, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan vetoed 4 bills, including a measure that he described as sanctuary state legislation. This legislation would require those counties that have agreements with immigration and custom enforcement to jail detainees, and he would force them to terminate those contracts by October 1st, 2022. Mike, this bill targets Frederick and Worcester counties, which have detainee contracts with ICE. What interest did the legislature have in what is really a local determination?
Well, I mean, it's the ongoing immigration discussion, and unfortunately, because we have such lack of leadership from the federal level, we then get to having a debate between the state and the jurisdictions, and I think that becomes a real challenge. One of the things I'm intrigued by, and I know this was a case that we had in Montgomery County early on, is the correctional facility had these relationships, and the rest of the jurisdiction in the county didn't necessarily know that relationship existed, which I think creates some interesting dynamics and something to pay attention to. I assume at this point, given the focus on immigration, that the legislators and the leaders in these counties understand that their correctional facilities are actually doing this. I think it's challenging. I think the state wants to say, hey, we don't necessarily want to be subject to an arcane set of rules, an arbitrary set of rules that the federal government's kind of put together. By the same token, it is hard when individual jurisdictions have made a decision. And so I think it's just this tension that only further reinforces that we've got to get back to what are we going to do with immigration reform at the federal level, so we actually know what rule we're all playing by.
Well, there is the argument that perhaps there's too much involvement at the state and local level, that the states and local localities shouldn't be making immigration determinations on their own.
I don't disagree to some degree, but the other challenge is, if this is a federal issue, then the feds should not be effectively deputizing state and local resources to do the job that they are then contracted to do. And so, if you're going to do it, and don't let us get in the middle of it. If you don't have the resources to do it, then that's a different conversation.
Well, the observation I'd make is you're never going to have any immigration reform, any series of different various proposals, unless a component of that includes effective enforcement. And that's been part of the deal, if you will, for all prior immigration proposals. It certainly was the proposals that had been under consideration. And part of the challenge of not having this sanctuary state legislation is it undermines whatever case folks may have for some sort of dreamer legislation. Since again, if you are not prepared to say that some people shouldn't be in the country and are legally excluded, then you really have trouble making kind of the compelling cases on behalf of those that there might be a consensus around including.
I think that becomes the challenge, though, is right now those are all kind of a la carte sets of activities, and so those haven't been stitched together in any meaningful way. And I think that becomes the challenge, is in the absence of that, saying we can't have this without this, then people are kind of picking and choosing on both sides of that equation. And so I think I agree with you that people have to know that both sides of that are going to work, but it's hard, I think, until people see from whichever vantage point they're looking at this, that we're willing to go here if we could see you're willing to go to the next step on the other. And I just, without any cohesion, it's really hard to get to that point.
Well, let's go on to our next topic, which also deals with criminal matters. And Governor Hogan vetoed a bill that would decriminalize possession of certain drug paraphernalia. And he also vetoed bills that would make people who are convicted of life and given life sentences eligible for parole at an earlier date. What is the likelihood that these vetoes will be overridden?
Well, unfortunately, this has tended to be a sort of party line issue, and actually there really are some conflicting public policy considerations. Unquestionably, we have a drug crisis heroin crisis of overdoses and what have you. And while I appreciate the reluctance to criminalize addiction, the point is to be made that when there are drug paraphernalia arrests, it's really often an opportunity for an intervention to take place. There are a variety of diversion programs that exist in the criminal justice system where folks can get treatment, and it can become a sort of fork in the road in which to turn around for recovery. And I think it's unfortunate that in this debate about criminalization and law enforcement generally, that what is lost is this particular opportunity to perhaps save lives by giving people an opportunity to get off the drugs that are ensnaring them.
Well, it's not just the decriminalization issue of drug paraphernalia, but it's also the issue of reducing sentences for individuals who have been who are on parole who are entitled to earlier parole. I mean, as the governor emphasized when he vetoed this, there are victims associated. It's not just that the defendants who have been convicted are incarcerated. There still remains living victims who suffered at the hands of criminal behavior. So these are two issues that the legislature is going to take up. But Mike, I want to before we go into this segment, I want to talk about an action that the governor announced the other day, which was he is among a growing list of governors who are proposing to cut off unemployment benefits earlier than anticipated and turning back federal dollars. Many have criticized him for this. What is the right decision here?
What's the right decision? That's an interesting one, because I know that there's the notion that because we have these unemployment benefits, that's what's leading to the challenges in the labor market and people aren't coming back to work. And I think that certainly could be a contributing characteristic, but I think you also have to look at, are people looking at other opportunities? Are there jobs there anymore? Do they need to change skills and get different places? And I think that it's challenging to say that it was solely the unemployment benefit that's the cause of people not coming back to work. And so the question is, how are we beginning to address those other issues to make sure that we actually have a pathway to get people back into the workforce? And it can't just
that may be true. Let's not just sugarcoat it. When we had welfare reform in the 90s under President Clinton, we saw people returning to the workforce. They had an incentive to go back to work and to look for a job. It was just today alone, Six Flags announced that they have 80 full-time positions that they can't fill because there are not enough people looking for jobs, and they're going to have reduced hours all summer long as a result. So there needs to be an incentive for people to go back to work.
And don't just take Six Flags or other employers' word for it. Mark Elridge has talked about the fact the county is having trouble opening facilities such as libraries because they didn't fill, as vacancies came up appropriately, they didn't fill those positions, and now they got to fill those positions, and they're having trouble finding people.
I think it's also interesting, though, to see what are those occupations being paid. I mean, I think that's one of the other pieces. And so to bring people back to a $9 an hour job, a $10 an hour job, and they can't make that work, I think the employers have got to look and understand the economics of the situation that we've got and make sure they're paying people a living wage to make that work.
Well, that's a very valid point. And just to stay on the Six Flag analogy, they announced that they're paying $13.65, up from $9.50 for full-time employees and part-time employees. So the competitive marketplace, which always is self-correcting, is at work again. So thank you for being so much in favor of the free enterprise system there, Mike.
As a small business owner, I got nothing else to do but that, buddy.
So I want, we haven't talked, it's unusual for us not to have talked about COVID at the very top of the show. And I want to roll into that next. Effective Friday, May 28th, this past Friday, Montgomery County joined the rest of the state to follow relaxed COVID-19 restrictions, including allowing fully vaccinated individuals to not wear masks while indoors. Now, Mark, I did my own non-scientific poll. I was down in Lower Slower, Delaware over the weekend, and virtually nobody there was wearing masks. It's the honor system, I suppose. But as soon as I came back to Montgomery County and went to my local Safeway, 98% of the people had masks on. Do we just love being told what to do here in Montgomery County, or what?
Montgomery County is a belt and suspenders and something else jurisdiction in terms of protections and what have you. But I also think, I think you alluded to it, there's more than a little bit of social shaming. I think there's kind of a critical mass when folks reach that point where they're going to take their masks off, and then everybody does. But we have not reached that. I've traveled as well and seen that elsewhere. There's places like Colorado. Believe me, they do not have the masks to the extent that we do in our community.
Although it was interesting, I was in South Florida 2 weekends ago, and there, even on South Beach, many people were wearing masks. And at any restaurant I went into, everyone was masked until they got to their table, and I was very, very surprised.
That does surprise me, because my Florida clients say that it's like the Wild West down there. This was earlier on. This was last January, when Florida was one of the few states not to enforce the mask requirements. Now, Mike, I want to continue on this theme about COVID, because, obviously the impact of the vaccinations has been tremendous in reducing the number of cases, thankfully so. One of the debating points along the way was, when could teachers and students be back in classrooms together? And it was announced this week that only 70% of the teachers have been fully vaccinated. So should the county require, or the school system require, that teachers be fully vaccinated in order that we fully open up in September?
I think so. I mean, I think we're wrestling with that right now at Montgomery College. But what we're finding, though, is that most of our employees, if they're not vaccinated yet, are getting vaccinated. We're making sure that they have opportunity to do that. I think you've got to do the same thing at the school system. Interestingly, I was just looking at my daughter's university, and they're mandating that all employees be vaccinated before they return, and have dates certain. So if you don't have your credentials in place by August 1st, indicating that's the case, you're not coming back. So I think, from a leadership perspective within the community, I think that you look to teachers to kind of take that lead, as you do others. But I think if you're going to be in a classroom and create a safe environment, you need to be in a position to help show what you're doing to contribute to that.
Well, but I think that what is also the part of this argument is, should students be vaccinated? And since there's very little evidence that students are harmed or at that age level are harmed by the coronavirus and are very unlikely to pass along, I'd rather have all the teachers vaccinated and not have the students vaccinated.
Well, and I just don't know what the timing of the students will be anyway, right? So we're rolling that out much more slowly. And so, so you're still under 12, are still not on the, in a position to be vaccinated yet. So I agree. I think it makes sense to have the teachers be vaccinated and all school employees. It's create a safe environment.
Even though Moderna announced just the other day that it's going to seek full approval for its vaccination, it's still an experimental drug at this point, an experimental use. And I just worry about vaccinating people younger than 12. And there have been many proponents who have encouraged that that should be done. So
I think since both Pfizer and Moderna have already filed for that, to me, and which is why I think it's important to have the teachers and employees vaccinated, because you have that piece addressed. And then I think it's necessarily going to take longer once those approvals come through to then make sure you get students vaccinated. And, We still have an interesting debate about whether or not the parents will get their children vaccinated with things prior to having this discussion. So I assume there will be a significant number of parents who will feel that way on these vaccines too.
Well,
I mean, I think the good news is that as the vaccine, we haven't reached that point now, but as the numbers do get up higher, we are reaching a point where virus is less likely to spread and it will be more limited. So we can accommodate those people who have sort of individual objections for whatever reason.
but when we went through this process last year, I mean, if you recall, we relaxed standards a great deal sometime after June and through the latter part of June, July, and August. And then as soon as we got into mid-September, when the coronavirus numbers started climbing up again, we had to retrench. And I think that, is going to be very difficult to do this next year and I hope there won't be a need for it. Sir.
But we're above 70% with vaccination. Actually, the number for the teachers sort of reflects the broader population. At least the
You mean they're in sync with the population at home?
That's roughly equivalent to where we were at Memorial Day in the state, 70%. So
well, we got to take a break now. So when we come back from this short break, there is another challenger among the many for county executive. They announced last week. Stay tuned. We'll let you know who that is. And welcome back. Term limited county council member Hans Riemer announced last week that he's running for county executive. Mike, is Riemer running to be an alternative to the county executive Mark Elrich, who's on the left, and businessman David Blair, who's considered more on the right?
Probably. I see David and Hans are kind of in the same space, which is interesting because that's what we got last election, where you ended up with about a group of three, including David Blair, Rose Krasnow, Roger Berliner, kind of in that same space, then kind of all vying for that same vote, which then opened the door for Mark, who I think most people recognize has a pretty solid 28-30% who will probably vote for him no matter what, which gives you a whole lot of other folks unless you start splitting that vote. I think the other interesting thing is you've still got a couple other people out there who have yet to indicate whether or not they're going to run. People like Nancy Navarro, Craig Rice, who again present some different dynamics from their backgrounds, but also kind of end up in that middle space. And so I'll be curious to see what happens over the course of the next couple months. Who else jumps in this?
Well, I mean, your comment is really well taken, because I mean, the Blair Elrich race was decided by 77 votes,
right?
Something of that nature. And in a multi-candidate election, I think that favors Mark because he does have such a strong core belief there. Mark, I want to go to you because 2 weeks ago, panelist Sam Statlin praised County Executive Mark Elrich for the good job he's done in office. And what's your assessment as to whether or not that's a sentiment that should be shared, or there are weaknesses that may open up the door for a David Blair or for a Hans Riemer?
Well, Sam has been absolutely consistent in support of the county executive. So I'll give him props there. He was a supporter before the primary last go around. I think the county has important challenges. I think we really need to talk about preserving services and maintaining services as opposed to some of the sort of virtual circuit signaling activities that we've been engaging in. So I think there's an opportunity. I'm not quite sure that Hans has got as sort of clear a lane. I think he's got some challenges there. And obviously, where there be additional council candidates getting in as well, I think that would squeeze him that much more.
Interestingly, I was going to say, I think the fact that COVID happened actually ends up benefiting Mark to some degree, because as we've talked here previously, he's taken a fairly conservative approach, which has resonated, as we've already talked about, with a lot of the county's residents. And so to the point where people are still wearing masks when they don't even have to be. And so I think because I think in the absence of that, it's really difficult to find anything that you can point to say Mark has really accomplished in this term.
Well, I think, the old axiom is you vote for or against the guy in office. And if you're going to vote against him, you got to be angry. And I don't see that dissatisfaction yet. I mean, it's a long time between now and next April when the primaries are, but I don't see that the strong dissatisfaction yet. So I hate admitting when Sam is right, but he may be right this time.
Well, he may be right that he wins. That doesn't necessarily mean he's done a good job. Those are two different things.
That is always there's always two different points of the spectrum. Now, before we go to parting shots, I mean, this was something that was of concern only to me, probably. Do either of you care that the White Flint Metro Station is being renamed North Bethesda?
I was going to make the observation that people take a long time being re-educated on names. I think of Montgomery Mall. Technically, Montgomery Mall hasn't been Montgomery Mall for quite some time. It's something else. And I have given up referring to CVS's as People's Drugs, but it takes a while for these changes to become part of the way people describe places.
Well, I'm just glad we aren't going to have to pay for it, that the federal government's going to make it.
Well, but I think it's indicative, though, of our previous conversation. So White Flint hasn't developed it the way we hoped White Flint would develop. And so if we change the name, perhaps we won't notice the fact that it hasn't built out the way we hoped it would build out.
Well, I remember when, of course I do, because I'm old, when White Flint first opened, and they had an I Magnin and a Joseph Magnin, and it was quite a attraction for Montgomery County shoppers who wanted high-end retail. So it's pretty amazing. Before we wrap, I mentioned two things. Former House of Delegate member and contributing 21 this panelist, Marce Morales, announced this week that she's running for District 4, the councilmanic seat currently held by Nancy Navarro, who is term limited and cannot run. I'm wishing Marce all good things. And educator Brandy Brooks announced that she's running for an at-large seat on the county council as well. Now we got to stay tuned for parting shots. And welcome back. Now with parting shots, Mike Knapp.
Thank you, sir. It's exciting now that we're actually beginning to see reopening. People are excited to get together, and we're starting to be caught by that euphoria. And I think we have to be very mindful of the fact that there are a lot of vestiges of what's happened over the last 14 months that are not just going to go away. And so one in particular is we've had basically prohibitions on on evictions as a result of non-payment of rent, and people have gotten payments to help begin to address that. But all of those prohibitions are going to be lifted here in the coming months. And I think local jurisdictions have to begin to think really hard about what's going to happen next and how to be able to address the realities of those folks who are actually providing the rent, the apartments, and those folks who are actually potentially being evicted, because there isn't.
Well, that was an interesting occurrence. We had technical difficulties, everyone, and unfortunately, Mark Uncapher was cut out. And so we're going to wrap up the show. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.